Well, um, welcome to anybody who's watching this program. My name is Fabiana Sorella, and this panel discussion has been organized to meet the requirements for the Coelho Law Fellowship at the Coelho Center for Disability Law Policy and Innovation at Loyola Marymount University. Today, we have a couple of amazing speakers who will be discussing strategies to make trainings inclusive for individuals with disabilities within organizations. I am very excited to welcome Carl Williams and Kimiko Davis to this discussion. And now I'm going to give some quick intros about both of them. So first, I'm going to start with Carl. He is a seasoned people strategist and the founder of September Day Consulting. He has over a decade of human resources experience, spanning talent acquisition, talent management, learning and development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging as well. He partners with organizations across corporate, nonprofit, hospitality, retail, and legal sectors to design practical, measurable solutions that drive lasting change. And Carl holds a master's in organizational leadership and different certifications in diversity and inclusion, HR, and nonprofit leadership. Um, and guided by his intersectional identity and lived experiences, he brings empathy, clarity, and a strategic insight to every engagement. To meet organizations where they are and help them embed equity into everyday practice. Okay, so that's Carl. Welcome, Carl. And
Thank
now
you
we
for having me.
have Kimiko Davis. Um, is an industrial organizational psychologist, a professional specializing in people and culture, data analysis, and leadership development. She leverages research driven strategies to assess and enhance workplace training programs, employee engagement, and organizational effectiveness. With a PhD in business psychology, she combines analytical expertise with a deep understanding of human behavior to drive meaningful change. And beyond her work in psychology, Kimiko is also a content creator and entrepreneur using her skills in sales, networking, and storytelling to connect with diverse audiences. Welcome, Kimiko. We're happy to have you here. Um, we're so excited that you both are here to help me out with this presentation. And now I'm gonna get started on the questions that I have listed for you. Um, so whoever wants to start first, that's completely fine. Um, okay, so first of all, why are inclusive training programs important for organizations?
I can start us off. I think Carl would agree that inclusive training programs are inevitable. I think there's been a rise in it, and I think that this is a topic that I'm really glad that you are talking about and organizations are talking about because not everybody is the same. And so it is inevitable that companies are going to need to include inclusiveness in their training programs. It hasn't been something that's been thought of before or the topic of mind, but it comes from an ethical standpoint to make sure that everybody gets the training that they deserve. And so, as an IO psychologist, I look at how systems impact individuals and organizational outcomes. And so, looking at training programs from a lens of it could be anything from visual to auditory trainings, is important to make sure that people belong and that they get the training that they deserve and that everybody else gets as well. There's also a recent study I read that highly engaged employees are 24% more likely to have higher engagement. And so it proves that not only is this effective in making people belong, but it can also be effective for organizations who want more highly engaged employees.
I love your answer, Kimiko. I can only build on what you've shared because that was really insightful. I think from my perspective as well, everything you said, in addition to that, it would be representation is really, really important, right? For two things. One, not just for the students who are going to be taking part in these trainings, but just the legal profession in general, right? People, in order to help people the way you really want to help them, you have to be able to understand their experiences. And so, just starting from a training perspective, being able to understand the differences in terms of how people assimilate information, how they receive it, how they process it, and how they then share it will help you to be able to reach them in a more meaningful way. I think also from a legal perspective, right? It's justice and equity, kind of like you said earlier, right? When you think about the different statutes that we have in place for things like accommodations, we put those things in place because we recognize that people are different inherently. And so I love the fact that we're thinking about it as people who are going to be defending the rights of other people to understand themselves and those individuals, right? And like you said, engagement is a really, really big part of it. Whenever you can make something as far as training relatable and connect with people, they're more likely to retain it. They're more likely to take that with them somewhere. And it doesn't just become something that they did because they had to do it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was very insightful. And now I'm going to go over to the next question that I have for you. Um, what are some best practices for designing training content that are accessible to individuals with visual, auditory, cognitive, and mobility impairments?
Carl, do you want to go first? Do you want to do like a back and forth? Like one person can start and then the next person?
Absolutely. So one of the first things that I think about from that perspective is the diversity in terms of how we present information. So for the legal writings and the study materials, are we doing prep ahead of time to make sure that they're handouts? Because one of the classic things is there are some people who will hear it, retain it, and will move on. Other folks need to be able to see it and be able to digest it in a different way. So just being able to identify the information you want to share, think about the audience of the people that you're trying to share that information with, think about the best way to reach them, and then customize that information to suit those different types of learners is going to get the best outcome because it's going to drive that engagement for everything that we're doing.
I completely agree. And adding on to that, I think there's different modalities to look at. So like you had mentioned, it could be things like audio, visual, text transcripts. I know that some trainings are in person. So like you said, printing things out, having things on a board. Um, the phrasing that you use for things is also very important, but there's also a big shift in virtual training right now as well. And so I think thinking of, are you adding captions to your trainings? Are you using clear, simple language? Because if you're using all these big fancy words and your audience, like you had said, Carl, is maybe people that might not understand those, how good is this training going to be? And it's actually going to probably lead to more frustration if you're not using simple language. And then also flexible pacing options if you are choosing to do more online trainings. So it's great to have a on call with everybody, but sometimes people get a little bit overwhelmed or aren't able to digest things as much in the moment. So maybe this is breaking things out into a couple different sessions. You can also use things like closed captioning. Sign language is really big as well. If people have an issue with that, hiring somebody in that can sign the trainings and having that readily available. So there's a lot of different methods that you can use when thinking about how you want to go about accessibility for individuals with visual, auditory, cognitive, mobility impairments like that.
Okay,
I,
great.
I, I love that. The one thing I will add to that is just from the perspective of being in the meetings, one of the things that I've always kind of preached for folks is when you're in front of somebody, so speaking specifically about instructor-led trainings, when you're in front of somebody, you want to make that the priority, right? But what that means is that with different people in the audience, if somebody's on their computer or their reader, back in the day, you would think that person's distracted, but it's that recognition of that bias to say, okay, you know, I have to assume that person is using that e-reader because that's the best way that this information is accessible for them. So that's what I wanted to call out is really starting with checking our biases, making sure that or bias as far as like how we learn, how typically quote unquote people have learned, that's not limiting the options that we provide to individuals, because that's been one of the biggest barriers for us to be able to reach as many people as we possibly can.
That's a great call out, Carl.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So insightful. Um, and then the next question that I have for both of you is um, just kind of like on what Kimiko was saying on um, technology now. So, how can technology and digital tools enhance the inclusivity of training programs for individuals with disabilities? And we can open it to like virtual or in-person trainings, like how technology can like shape both sides of this type of training programs.
That's a great question. I always say when technology works, it's the best, and when it doesn't, it's the worst. And so,
Yeah.
with this topic of technology on the rise, I think practicing is really important to understanding how to use these tools. I think a lot of people have them and they're like, this is great. But then they actually go to practice them and they don't know how to incorporate them into trainings, and they focus more on the training material. And so I think there needs to be equal of importance on what technology organizations are choosing to use, really studying that. How can you utilize that in the best way? And then also having accessibility top of mind when picking out the tools to use. So this could include things like text to speech or adaptive learning platforms. Simulations are great as well, but making sure that you can use those for all different kinds of people with disabilities. And then one specifically, I wanted to also have some in my back pocket, Otter AI. I don't know if you guys have used that before. I've used it in meetings, I've used it in presentations, trainings. It's a great AI-powered transcript tool that I highly recommend if companies are looking into that.
I love that you brought that up, Kimiko, because for me personally, I use actual Fathom for like note taking, and it's changed my life. When I talk to people, I tend to want to be present, especially when I do diversity and inclusion, and we're talking about things that might be uncomfortable or sensitive to people. I want to be present, but I also need to retain a lot of the things that you're saying to me. It's just being able to use those kind of tools to be able to get the transcribed conversation or even just the recording helps me to then afterwards go, okay, we had a great conversation. How do I follow up with this person, right? And the same thing, if this was a course that I was doing, I would want to be able to then go back and review my notes, right? So it's a new way of doing that. And I think about somebody who might not be able to type like I did in college, to be able to just have that transcript or, the audio to be able to go over. Um, Two things I wanted to call out. One was just an overarching theme here is that we have to think about our audience, right? And I know we're talking about law students, but in a setting where there might be partners or just attorneys or just legal professionals in general, right? Being cognizant of the fact that that group has historically been a group that's really risk averse in terms of like technology. They're not really big on trying new things. And so just thinking about the audience and going, okay, if we're going to add technology, we need to make sure that it's going to be something that's simple for them, something that's going to be easy to use, and something that's going to add value. So not just, oh, this is really cool and fun, let's do it because it'll be great, but really thinking about the experience people are going to have that's going to really make a difference. I am a big fan of that Mentimeter. I think if you're having a training session and you're the only one talking and you keep going, what is your opinion? What is your thought? That's hard because you're going to put people on the spot. So things like Menti or Mentimeter allows you to have polling, for instance. So people can use their phones, they can use their computers. So they're still engaging with you, but nobody has to be seen as being singled out when if I was to say, Fabiana, what do you think about this? I want to engage, I want to participate, but on my terms. So those are the two things I definitely wanted to make sure I follow up as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, and then now, next question would be what strategies can trainers use to create a psychologically safe space where all individuals feel comfortable participating?
I'll get started here. I would say that one that is very obvious, maybe, but not so obvious because I've been in too many sessions where it's not that obvious. It's starting from a place of respect. right? And because so much of I think the challenges that we incur in these sessions is when people don't feel respected. So when I have any kind of sessions or any kind of training about any topic, really, one of the first things I do is to try to kind of get us all on the same page, get an agreement as far as how we're going to go through this training. So set those parameters as far as like making sure people know where we're operating from a place of respect, right? So we can challenge each other, but there's a difference between challenging and arguing or attacking, right? Giving people the option up front to be like, if you feel like this is a topic you can't talk about, here's what you do. If you need to step out, please do so. If you need to, giving them options in terms of how they can manage their own experience up front and having the whole group agree to that. It creates that space where, as much as you possibly can in that setting, you feel like you can share. And if you do, you're reported. But if you don't want to share, it is also okay, or at least there are other options available to you, whether through like something like Mentimeter or just being able to talk afterwards.
That's a great point. In addition to respect, which I think is of high importance, especially when you're leading a training session, for you to be respected and for you to respect others, is authenticity and vulnerability. I think when having these really hard conversations, especially if it involves DEI or things that might make people feel a little bit more uncomfortable, is maybe as the trainer to open things up with vulnerability and saying, like, hey, maybe I might not know everything, but here I am to help and I want to be a resource to you, and really opening up that vulnerability to share the relationship between you, and understanding, hey, we're all humans. So no matter what the training is, leading with that. Were you going to add something, Carl?
As you were saying that, I was just thinking, thinking of like a law setting where it's law students, a potential, depending on who's leading the training, there's some power dynamics as well, right? And so here you are, if you're a professor or somebody external, you're like, I want to make a great impression, but I also need all the things that were just described. And if those aren't established, what do I do? So just being able to recognize that depending on who's presenting and who you're presenting to, there's just naturally going to be an imbalance there, and figuring out a way to make sure that people focus on the content and being present and not the dynamic. By to your point, being authentic and maybe addressing that up front and what to do.
Definitely. There's something that you had talked about in the last question that I also wanted to bring back into this one. It comes from an example that I had when I was co-leading a facilitation of a group for an organization of mine. And we're just talking to everybody, and I noticed that somebody that had more of an auditory issue, um, didn't feel like speaking as much, which is totally fine. But at the beginning, I did address, if you want to take notes, if you want to chime in the chat, making sure you offer all of those up front, of all the different ways that people can participate, maybe if they're not the extroverted one that wants to talk every time a question is asked, really allowing the space and the resources for people to speak up if they want to in other ways, I think is really important. And we saw that with this individual. They did not want to speak, but because we offered all these options, they ended up taking notes. And at the end of the meeting, they wanted to feel like they could contribute. And so they said, hello, I wrote a summary of everything. Can I share that with everyone? And that was such an inspiring moment for us. And I think it really shows that how people can participate can also change if they participate.
I love that, because you just basically showed us how if we normalize the accommodation aspect of it, we benefit from it. Because to your point, if nobody else was taking notes, and that person through their own need to take notes a particular way can go, hey, you're busy doing this, I was enjoying it, here's my contribution to that. So I love that normalizing of just being able to, so rather than even asking for the accommodations, like, here's a bunch of ways that you can do this, just let us know, and make it like as a matter of fact, another like, do you need something? Because I think that's also the other part of it, is not singling people out. Because I've been in sessions where I know people need specific things and I've made the offer, and I know because people might still see them, they might go, I don't want to be that person. So sometimes I'll still lean into that just to make it normal. It's like, oh, do you need something? I need something. And to your point again. So love all of this. We talk about it all day.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is great information. So really appreciate all of you sharing this with us. Okay, and then the next question would be, what are some common challenges that you think organizations face when trying to make trainings more inclusive, and how can they overcome them?
I think two big ones are people seeing trainings, especially including DEI or inclusiveness trainings, as not essential. And I don't think that's true. I think if anything, they're essential and needed, and it affects the organization more than business leaders think. But one of the common challenges I have seen over and over again is perceived cost of trainings, of the work that it goes into to make sure everything's accessible, time on things, but the resources and the time that it takes doesn't have to be something more. I think it could be easily worked in, but I think at a company standpoint, when developing training programs, business leaders are thinking more about cost, right? So from the CEO level, you're thinking about, okay, how much is this going to cost me? How much is this going to cost the people going through these programs? Because this is time taken out of their daily work. And so I think that's really big, as well as resistance to change. So the offering of these programs and then the people going through these programs, sometimes people are like, oh no, I know all of this, don't worry. So it's coming to the board and just saying, hey, we don't all know everything. Even if you could take one small thing away from this, it could be this.
I love all of those. So for me, I know that my perspective is really around inclusion type trainings, but I think just in any kind of trainings that we do, everything you said is so valid, right? Because whether it's diversity and inclusion or just any other kind of trainings, those are some of the common threads of what you hear people complain about, right? And because as I think about it, is the big thing for me that comes to mind is the fact that there needs to be preparation. You can't show up today and go, we're going to make this training inclusive, because right out the gate right now, you would have already missed the chance, because some people in that session might have needed to get the notes ahead of time to read and to kind of get themselves confident. Otherwise, starting out, there are people who are probably just really anxious right now thinking, oh, and they start focusing on that anxiety of, I'm not prepared, rather than hearing anything you're saying. And these are the kind of things that you lose productivity, you lose the engagement of people. And so when you do the survey afterwards and you get these maybe low scores, or you're not seeing the information that was shared, being used, you're questioning, you're going, why was this not very good? And you think it's a training, but it's that work that needs to go in advance, right? So something as simple as the physical, so going back to the levels that we had, visual, auditory, cognitive, physical, etc. It's, if you're gonna have a session. So I had this happen to me, well, not to me specifically, but I was in a location and I had a couple experts that were speaking about accessibility in business. And the conference room that they were using, while the building had elevators, the conference room had about 5 or 6 steps that went from the main lobby up to that conference room. And there were no elevators, there wasn't a ramp. And when I saw that, I was just scratching my head going, wait, so you're talking about how to help others basically be inclusive, right? Or accessibility within business. And you've invited people in wheelchairs and they've had to be pulled up over steps. So just something like that, where that person already had a bad experience. And I don't think anything they're going to be told about accessibility in business is going to register with them when the expert failed to recognize that people might have different levels of ability or different able, just not being able to attend, right? So just stuff like that, thinking about it beforehand. And as I think about that, to your point, for leaders and from a cost perspective, what is the cost of what you lose in terms of business by creating that bad experience versus going, okay, let's make sure that we have, if it's even a checklist, do we have this in different modalities? Do we have pre-reads available to people? Do we have work afterwards so that people can really engage and really be thoughtful about it? So I think for me, the big thing is being thoughtful ahead of the meeting, planning ahead, and in the meeting being present, but also figuring out what the follow-up is going to be, because otherwise we lose the ability to get that full engagement.
Great, great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then we have the next question, which would be, what metrics or indicators should organizations track to measure the success of accessible training programs?
I can jump into this. The first thing is, I think is very basic and very obvious. It's a survey. So even potentially doing a pre-session survey, whether it's a virtual or in-person led instructor-led or training, is to do a survey before I do one afterwards, and where you can ask things about that, about the options that are provided. did you feel like it provided enough options for you to be able to access it? And people will be honest, especially if it's confidential. Then people might say, no, I didn't have enough, or I felt like I had enough. And just using that data point to be able to then go over time, what do we need to do? Because if everybody's saying they didn't have enough, then we really need to take a step back and look at it, right? Because ultimately, any adjustments we make will increase the ability for people to digest the information and make it useful to them. So that's first one I'd kind of use going out the gate.
Yeah, that's a great one. I echo that sentiment for pre and post surveys, or retro style surveys are commonly used as well to be able to access any key performance indicators, engagement, facilitator feedback, general feedback. You can look at things like ROI and include these in the survey so that you can figure out if the cost was an issue before. Hey, look at all these people that went through this. Look at this return on investment. You can look at things like absenteeism, presenteeism, if you're working internal in HR, looking at turnover rates, all those different things to help then make the case for more trainings in the future. So that's definitely a big one, is surveying. There sometimes is a bias though. That is the one additive I will add about surveying, is people usually take surveys if they love it, or they take it if they hate it. And so if there's some incentive that companies could have to get everybody to take these surveys, I would highly encourage that. That's a little note that I would add. And there are also accessibility audits that you can do to basically understand how people with disabilities actually interacted with the content. So that'd be more of online programs, but something that is easily looked into as well.
I love what you said about the online programs, because as you were talking, that was kind of what was in the back of my mind. Just as simple as, you know how when you get an email, even from retail, they know how you, if you clicked on it or not, even if you're far away. Something similar to that, where if you have that follow-up content or before content, you'd be able to kind of tell if people were using it as another data point for you to be able to determine what to do. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to collect so much information. And to your point, if people hate it and they share that feedback, that'll only make it better. And if people love it and they share that feedback, then we can, strengthen what we're doing. So any feedback will be useful in regards to this. Is when we don't get any feedback is when we should worry, because ultimately people will love and hate it.
Exactly, especially with the rise in data. I know the SIOP conference just happened last weekend, and resounding information on data and a big push to get this data. So very relevant topic we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you. And then I know you both have done some work on leadership. So the next question is kind of like just asking a little bit about how do you think leaders could actively model inclusive behavior toward employees with disabilities within organizations?
There's a lot of, when it comes to leadership, there's a lot of different styles that leaders have. And I think the biggest one that I've seen be very effective with audiences and leaders is transformational leadership. So do you walk the walk? Do you talk the talk? And in this case, I would really encourage leaders to also participate in these trainings. I think if you're asking people to go through these, you should understand what the trainings are like as well. So that would be the biggest piece, is for leaders participating in these, showing your support for these, as well as a call for accessibility features, like I had mentioned before, of calling those out of, hey, we've included captions for these videos. Feel free to take notes. We sent over all the information beforehand, so you have that on file. So leaders being very vocal in sharing those accessibility options for others, as well as using very clear language and asking encouraging questions for audiences. I think that's some of the biggest ways that leaders can be involved in trainings.
I absolutely agree with everything you just said. In addition to that, I would add just two things which are kind of build off what you already shared. Is one, being present, right? So it's not just okay for you to show up for a training. So I think of this as in a law firm setting where you may have a bunch of interns or just new employees, and a partner shows up and they're trying to show that they're accessible to people, but then you're on your phone the whole time. Everybody's busy. We all know that. But if you're going to be in that session, because everybody's looking at you and your behavior is going to be mirrored whether you want it to or not. So I think for me, it's recognizing the impact that you will have and be an ally. So an ally will be coming in to any training and making sure that, especially because you know that there might be people who need accommodations, helping the trainer or facilitator to normalize some of the accommodation space, right? Being present, being accessible. I think those are really, really important. Again, not with DNI training specifically, but just any kind of training from my perspective is that normalization of that. And also just from a respect perspective, just tying into the modeling of the behavior, if a facilitator is asking about accommodations or delivering things a particular way, and you make a face or you laugh or you make a gesture or something, in your mind you're just like, oh, that's not my thing. But as a leader, there's a bigger responsibility because again, that power dynamic, no matter who that trainer is or the facilitator is for any kind of training, when a senior person or leader comes into that session, it changes the dynamic. And everybody's really looking at their behavior. So a leader's ability to recognize everything you said and being respectful, being an ally, normalizing these things will go so much farther in taking the key themes away from just the training into practice every single day.
I think that's such good points of how you show up to those trainings. And I think another point is, what do you do after those trainings? Do you keep modeling these things? Do you check in with people that were also in the trainings? Because trainings are great, but it needs to be carried out after that. And so how do you lead during the training and how do you lead after the training are what really matter?
Absolutely agree with that.
Thank you so much. And then I have just the last question, which I think is spot on for both of you because you're consultants. So, what are the benefits and challenges of involving accessibility experts or consultants in course development?
Kimiko.
I can start us off. Some of the challenges we had already mentioned on this call, so this could be budget limitations. Another thing that I've seen is integrating this into the learning and development process. As an external consultant, sometimes I come in wanting to help. I've been asked to help, and people have resistance for people outside of the company coming in with some different expertise. And so I would just ask that people be open to any external consultants coming in. We've done a lot of work on this. We've done a lot of research. We are just coming to help. So that's definitely a challenge that I have seen, as well as just resistance from internal teams. But there are plenty of benefits as well. By providing these trainings, you can have higher engagement. And I think coming in as a consultant in course development for these things, we have a lot of credibility and innovation that we just want to share. We've all experienced these things, and so we come in with the heart and knowledge to make things better for people.
I love everything you said. I think we're very similar in terms of how we approach this. One of the things I think about us from a benefits perspective of having, pros help with this is you get to a measurable ROI, right? Because earlier we talked about one of the limitations or the negatives here is that it costs money, right? But having somebody take a step back and help you understand, the difference between, oh yeah, the work that you're going to do up front is going to be timely, it's going to cost you a bit of money, but that's an initial investment. But here's how this is going to help you down the line. When you have employee engagement skyrocketing because people feel like they're seen and heard, when you have people being better allies, just the general culture of the organization has shifted, not just because of any kind of training, but just because outside of the training, those same behaviors are being mirrored or those same behaviors are being implemented, right? Where people are thinking through, if I'm having a meeting, how do I make sure that everybody in this meeting feels like they can be seen and heard? So those are my big things is you get measurable ROI because we're going to do the data. We're going to help you set stuff up. We're going to help you figure out the points to check and measure, and then be able to say, here's the actual cost upfront, long term, and you will naturally see a difference between the initial, oh, we have to pay for a consultant, here's somebody here, to where, okay, all of our processes are working and we see lower turnover, we see higher engagement, right? So I love that part of it. And a big part of it for me is also just making sure that people are seen, especially in learning organizations where training is a really big part of the experience, and in law where people are always either doing a CLE requirement or doing a lot of reading. I feel like in environments like that, training really plays an even bigger role because it sets the tone for kind of how the organization learns, how they communicate, and how they set specific ways of doing things, communication and moving forward. And so being able to tie that all in together with the help of a professional is brilliant. The only limitations I see is the fact that, like you said, people are resistant to change. It will take time. None of this is perfect. None of this is going to be perfect out the gate because every organization is different, every school is different, et cetera, and the cost. But those are things that I feel if we're able to get the work done, we can easily show a higher return on the investment that went in.
One more thing I just wanted to add as you're speaking, it was coming to me too, is that a lot of companies with internal HR, internal learning and development, sometimes when they hear about these accessibility requirements, they get very overwhelmed. And it's okay to admit that you don't know everything. I don't know everything. I'm still learning every single day. And so if that means hiring external consultants to come on board and be that person for you to help your team understand more, to kickstart some projects and hand it off to the learning and development team, that is okay. And you actually might be saving more money than you think versus having somebody spend a lot of time on something they don't know a lot about versus bringing an external consultant who is specialized in that in. So I just wanted to add that point too.
I think that is really the cost of everything, right? It's again that time and money, the time spent on this versus I actually, as a funny thing, what I did, I always say to people, think about everybody as having a bill rate because lawyers will know and appreciate this. But if you think of your business service folks, so the people you talked about, the internal HR, the internal learning development folks, et cetera, if they had a bill rate and they spent X amount of hours, trying to learn about a thing to then be able to teach it and you add that and be like, whoa, that's way more than if a professional came in, be able to kind of, because as a professional, you're going to come in, you're like, here's what we need to fix. Here's what I know. Here's some techniques that we're using in industry. Because that's also the other part I think is always valid is that industry expertise that if it's not a job that you're doing on a regular basis or you're talking with external folks, you may not know what the current trends are, right? And what you might be teaching might be great, but there might be an easier way to do it. So love everything about what you just said.
Likewise.
Okay, well, thank you so much once again. This is it for our discussion. Would you like to add any comments, thoughts, or anything else before we log off?
Thank you so much for having this. And thank you for pivoting these conversations and not being afraid to talk about them and to bring experts in because I've learned so much in this, even just hearing Carl's perspective and getting tips and tricks from him. I think we're always constantly learning. So thank you for having us. Thank you for initiating these. And I really look forward to seeing everything that you guys are going to do.
Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you for having me as well. I love these types of conversations. It's particularly important to me having worked in a law firm setting and recognizing that so much of what's going on in the world right now, lawyers are going to be superheroes, right? They're going to be the people that are going to help us navigate so much of the uncertainty that we might be feeling right now. And I feel like being able to have conversations where we recognize that even if you're a lawyer or a law student, there are different ways that you see and experience the world and making sure that you feel seen and heard. It moves forward into the future where those lawyers then make it easy for people who are like them or different from them to be seen and heard, right? So it really just it's important to me and I love that you're doing that because that's where it starts. We can't have really diverse and inclusive lawyers if we don't start from the beginning.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate both of you. You guys are making a huge impact by being part of this panel and helping law students learn more about inclusive trainings and just thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And we'll keep in touch.
Thank you. Bye.
Great.
Thanks. Bye.